My appendix ruptured on the morning of my sister-in-law's wedding, sending me into emergency surgery. I believed the worst had passed until my mother-in-law entered my hospital room, accused me of staging the crisis, and struck the area of my fresh incision. My appendix burst on my sister-in-law's wedding day. My mother-in-law walked into my hospital room and slapped my fresh surgical wound. I woke up that morning already in pain, a dull ache under my ribs. I told myself it was nerves. Linda had spent months planning this wedding. Megan's big day. Nothing could interfere. Not traffic, not weather, not unnecessary drama, as Linda liked to call anything that wasn't about her daughter. By 9, I couldn't stand up straight. The pain had moved, sharp now, low on my right side. My husband Daniel found me on the bathroom floor, sweat soaking through my bridesmaid robe. My hands were shaking. "We're going to the ER," he said. I tried to argue. Megan was his only sister. He was supposed to walk their mother down the aisle. I was supposed to be in the photos. Then everything went black. At the hospital, they told me my appendix had ruptured. Infection was spreading fast. The surgeon said another hour and it could have killed me. Daniel called Megan. She cried, but told him to stay with me. Linda didn't cry. She said I staged the whole thing, out of jealousy. She told Daniel to leave the hospital and get back before the ceremony started. When he refused, she stopped picking up his calls. Surgery took almost 2 hours. 2 hours where Daniel sat in a waiting room alone, still dressed for a wedding he was never going to reach. When I opened my eyes, he was sitting beside me, suit wrinkled, tie hanging loose around his neck. He never made it to the ceremony. He didn't seem to care. At 7 that evening, the door swung open. Linda stood there in her silver gown, makeup smeared, eyes furious. "You ruined everything," she said. Daniel shot up. "Mom, get out!" She didn't listen. She walked straight toward my bed. "Megan walked down the aisle without her brother," she snapped. "Guests kept asking where you were. Do you have any idea what you did?" My throat was raw. I could barely speak. Linda leaned in closer. "Stop pretending." Then her hand came down, right on my incision. Pain tore through me. The monitors screamed. Daniel lunged, yanking his mother back before she could touch me again. "What did you just do?" he shouted. Nurses flooded the room. One yelled for security. Another ripped back the blanket to check the wound. The hit had torn something loose inside. Blood was already soaking through the bandage, spreading fast across white sheets. Linda's face changed. For the first time, she looked scared. Daniel pointed at the door. "You are not my mother right now. You just hurt my wife." Security arrived fast. And that's when Linda's story changed. "She grabbed me," she said, voice shaking. "I was defending myself." Daniel stared at her like he'd never seen her before. "She just came out of surgery. She can barely lift her arm." They took me back into the operating room past midnight. When I woke up, Daniel was still there, still holding my hand. "You're going to be okay," he said, "but you're stuck here a few more days." I asked about Linda. His jaw tightened. "The police arrested her. A nurse saw everything, and the hallway camera caught all of it. Linda walking in, my scream, Daniel pulling her off me." Daniel's phone started ringing, nonstop. His aunt, his cousins, even Megan. All asking the same thing. Could we just call it a misunderstanding? Daniel looked at the screen, then at me. Then he turned the phone off completely. But Linda wasn't done talking, because by morning, she'd already told the whole family a very different story about what happened in that room. By the time the sun came up, the story wasn't about a 58-year-old woman hitting a woman 4 hours out of surgery. The story was about me. Ungrateful, dramatic. A wife who'd hijacked her sister-in-law's wedding for attention and then attacked her own mother-in-law when she tried to talk sense into her. I found out because Daniel's cousin Priya texted him a screenshot from the family group chat, the one I wasn't in, the one that existed specifically so Linda could say things about me without me seeing them. Daniel read it out loud in a voice I'd never heard him use before. Flat and careful, like he was diffusing something. Claire has always resented how close Danny is with his family. I think losing her temper post-surgery just brought it to the surface. I forgive her. I just hope she gets the help she needs. 22 people had reacted with hearts. "She's rewriting it in real time," Daniel said. He was standing by the window. Phone gripped so hard his knuckles had gone white. "She's not even denying she was in the room. She's just changing what happened inside it." I told myself it wouldn't matter. There was a camera in the hallway. There was a nurse who'd seen the whole thing. There was a chart, a torn incision, a second surgery. Facts don't need permission to be true. I was wrong about how little that would count for, at least at first. By that afternoon, the group chat had a new thread going. One Daniel's cousin screenshotted in pieces because Linda had started deleting her own messages minutes after posting them. A habit I'd learned later that Detective Cole called consciousness of guilt behavior, without a hint of irony in her voice. One message survived long enough to be captured. "I just want everyone to remember I raised that boy right, and I would never hurt anyone on purpose." The word purpose sat there doing a lot of quiet work. Nobody in the chat asked her to clarify what she meant by it. 22 hearts again. Daniel's hands were shaking when he showed me the screenshots. Not from anger, exactly. More like the specific vertigo of watching someone you've known your whole life narrate a version of events with your own wife's blood still drying on a hospital sheet somewhere somewhere down the hall? She's not even bad at it, he said. That's the part I can't get past. She's good at this. Detective Renata Cole came to my room on my third post-op day. A stocky woman in her mid-40s with a Fresno PD badge clipped to her belt and 14 years on the job, the last 6 of them in crimes against persons. She had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she already half believed you, which I later learned was a technique, but at the time it felt like the first oxygen I'd had in days. I've watched the hallway footage twice, she told me, notepad open on her knee. I want to hear it from you before I watch it a third time. I told her everything. The door opening, the gown, the accusation, the hand coming down on the incision like she was swatting a fly. Detective Cole didn't interrupt. She wrote in short bursts, glancing up between sentences. Your nurse, Priya Anand, charge nurse on the floor that night, gave a statement within an hour of the incident. It matches yours down to the word slap. That's not common. People usually round their language up or down depending on how upset they are. You two use the identical word independently. She tapped her pen against the pad. That matters more than people think. She told me the wound had reopened along roughly 4 centimeters of the incision line and that the trauma had introduced a risk of infection serious enough that my surgeon, Dr. C.E. Marcus Feldman, had gone back in that same night to do what he called a washout, irrigating the site, checking for internal bleeding, closing it again under sterile conditions. He'd photographed the wound before the second procedure. Those photographs, Detective Cole said, were now logged into evidence with a case number and a chain of custody log, the same as anything else that could disappear or get misplaced if nobody was watching. Right now, what we've got is misdemeanor battery, she said. Given the injury and the medical setting, the DA's office may look at elevating that. I can't promise you what they'll charge. I can promise you the evidence doesn't care whose mother she is. She pulled a small tablet from her bag and turned it toward me, angling it so the fluorescent light didn't wash out the screen. The hallway footage was grainier than I expected. Time-stamped in the corner, 7:04:18 p.m. Climbing forward 1 second at a time. I watched a version of myself I couldn't remember being. Small under the blanket, one arm taped to an IV line, utterly unprepared for the woman crossing the frame in silver. I made myself watch it twice. The second time, Detective Cole paused it on the frame just before contact. See her shoulder there? She said, tapping the glass. That's not someone reaching out to comfort a patient. That's wind-up. I've watched a lot of these. Bodies don't lie about intent, even when the person attached to them does. I asked her what would happen next. Next, she gets arraigned. Next, she probably gets herself a lawyer who tells her to stop talking. And next, your family is going to find out that cameras don't forgive people just because everyone loves them at Thanksgiving. I laughed for the first time in 3 days. It hurt. Everything hurt. But I laughed. I told myself, in that hospital bed, that once people saw the footage, this would end. That was the first lie I let myself believe, and it took less than a week to prove me wrong. Linda hired Harold Whitfield, a defense attorney who'd represented half the country club by then, a man Daniel's family had known socially for 20 years. Whitfield's first move wasn't to challenge the footage, it was to challenge me. He sent, through Linda, a message relayed by Daniel's Aunt Carol that Linda would be willing to let the whole unfortunate incident go if I would sign a statement saying the contact had been unintentional, occurring during an emotional exchange, with no lasting harm. In exchange, Linda would drop what she was now calling her complaint, a claim that I had grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise it, filed 2 days after mine, conveniently timed to make it look mutual. She's trying to make it a wash, Daniel said, reading the message over my shoulder. 2 women, 2 accusations, cancel each other out, everybody goes home. My hands started shaking the way they had in the bathroom the morning this all began, not from pain this time, from the specific cold realization that the woman who had hurt me was now trying to make herself my equal victim, using my own recovering body as leverage in a negotiation I hadn't agreed to enter. I called Detective Cole. She was blunt. There's no bruise on her wrist in any photo she's submitted. If she files a formal complaint, we'll want your phone's photo timestamps from the day, the hospital's visitor log showing exactly when she entered, and anyone else on the floor at the time. Don't sign anything Whitfield sends you. Not a statement, not an apology, not a Christmas card. Nothing. I didn't sign it. 2 weeks later, the wrist complaint quietly disappeared, the way things do when nobody follows through on a lie because the follow-through is where lies die. The second thing I learned to rationalize away was the silence from Megan. I'd expected her to call. Instead, I got one text, 4 days after her wedding, 4 days after her mother put me back under a surgeon's knife. I'm so sorry this happened during my wedding. I hope you feel better soon. Nothing about her mother. Nothing about what Linda had done. Just an apology shaped like a door closing gently instead of slamming. I told myself she was new newly married, overwhelmed, protecting her own peace. I told myself grief makes people go quiet before it makes them go loud. I told myself a lot of things that week, mostly because the alternative, that Megan had chosen her mother's version over mine before even asking me what happened, was too heavy to hold on top of everything else. The evidence caught up to that denial too, 3 weeks later, when Carol, the same aunt who'd relayed Whitfield's offer, called Daniel in tears and told him something she said she couldn't carry alone anymore. The evidence caught up to that denial too, 3 weeks later, when Carol, the same aunt who'd relayed Whitfield's offer, called Daniel in tears and told him something she said she couldn't carry alone anymore. This wasn't the first time. 11 years earlier, before Daniel and I met, his father's brother had married a woman named Renee. Carol remembered her clearly. Quiet, kind, the kind of daughter-in-law who brought homemade tamales to every holiday. Renee and Linda had clashed from the start, the way Linda and I had, over things that always sounded small until you added them up. Whose recipe got served, whose opinion got asked, who stood where in photographs. The marriage ended within 3 years. Renee told a cousin once that Linda had shown up at her apartment after a miscarriage and told her she'd brought it on herself with all that stress and arguing. Nobody in the family repeated it after that. Renee moved to Bakersfield and stopped coming to anything. "I should have told you sooner," Carol said. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I'm telling you now because I don't want there to be a third one of you." Daniel sat with that for a long time before he spoke. "She's done this before," he finally said. "She just usually does it quiet enough that nobody has to choose a side." This time, there was a hallway camera. This time, there wasn't room for quiet. The wound didn't heal in a straight line, and neither did the rest of it. 10 days after the reopening, a fever spiked to 101.4 overnight. Dr. Feldman ran cultures and found a low-grade infection setting up shop at the reopened site. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, just the slow, stubborn kind that means another week of IV antibiotics and a second scar layered directly over the first, thinner and angrier looking than the original incision line. He showed me the photos side by side, before and after the second surgery, and said the word avoidable twice, like he needed me to hear it land. I asked him if he'd testify to that if it came to it. "I'll testify to what's in the chart," he said. "The chart says a healing surgical wound was subjected to blunt force trauma 4 hours post-op, resulting in dehiscence and a secondary infection requiring further intervention. I don't need to editorialize. The chart does that on its own. The infection cost me more than the antibiotics. It cost me 3 weeks of physical therapy I hadn't planned on, because scar tissue that reopens and reheals doesn't stretch the same way. And lifting my arm above my shoulder sent a pulling sensation down my side that made me stop mid-motion, every time, like my own body had learned to flinch before I told it to." My physical therapist, a patient, unhurried man named Oscar Reyes, kept a laminated pain scale taped to the wall of his office, and for the first 2 weeks I couldn't get past a 4 without my eyes watering. I told him once, offhand, that I was angrier at how slow it was than at the woman who'd caused it. He didn't try to correct me. He just adjusted the resistance band and said, "Anger's allowed to go wherever it needs to go. Just don't let it decide when you're done healing." I thought about that more than I expected to in the months that followed. That was the same week I started seeing Dr. Elena Voss, a clinical psychologist Detective Cole had recommended, someone who specialized in what she called relational trauma with a legal dimension, a phrase that sounded clinical until you realized it meant people whose families hurt them and then made them doubt it happened. I went in expecting to talk about the slap. I ended up talking about every dinner for 6 years where I'd swallowed something Linda said because Daniel would look at me afterward like, "Please, just let it go." For me, "You're allowed to have needed him to not ask you that," Dr. Voss said in our 3rd session. Every time. I didn't cry in the room. I cried in the parking lot, in the car, with the AC not yet cold, for 11 minutes by the dashboard clock. And then I drove home and made dinner because that's what you do, even when something in you has finally been named. The 4th thing came from Diane Okafor, the hospital's patient advocate and risk manager, a woman with a calm, unhurried voice who called me 2 weeks after discharge to say there was something I needed to know. Linda sat on the hospital's community auxiliary board, a volunteer position, mostly ceremonial, mostly about fundraising galas and gift shop ribbon cuttings. And she'd used that connection to ask a records clerk, informally, whether my chart included any prior mental health history. The clerk hadn't pulled anything, but she had mentioned the request to her supervisor, who mentioned it to Diane, who was now, in her words, required by law and by conscience, to tell me my privacy had been targeted, even unsuccessfully. "This is a HIPAA violation regardless of outcome," Diane said. "The request itself is the breach. We're opening a formal compliance investigation and your mother-in-law, will be receiving a letter revoking her board position pending the outcome." She walked me through what the investigation would actually involve: an internal audit of who had accessed or attempted to access my chart, interviews with the clerk and her supervisor, a report that would go to both the hospital's compliance officer and, if warranted, the state licensing board that oversaw the auxiliary program's affiliated vendors. documents. It sounded, on paper, almost bureaucratic, a stack of forms and timestamps. But Diane's voice had an edge under the professionalism, the particular steadiness of someone who took the rule seriously because she'd seen what happened to people when it wasn't enforced. For what it's worth, she said before we hung up, the clerk did the right thing. She said no, and then she told someone. That's usually the part that doesn't happen. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call, back against the cabinet, and understood something I hadn't let myself understand yet. Linda wasn't trying to defend a slap anymore. She was trying to prove I was the kind of woman who deserved one. She needed a diagnosis. A history, some paper trail that would let her rewrite the last 6 years as my instability instead of her cruelty. And when she couldn't find one, she'd tried to manufacture the search for one, as if the looking itself might be enough to plant the doubt. It almost was. I caught myself, twice that week, wondering if I really had overreacted somewhere along the way, in some dinner I couldn't remember, some argument where I'd raised my voice first. That's the part nobody tells you about this kind of family. It's not just what they do to you, it's what they get you to start doing to yourself. The fifth pressure point came through Richard. Daniel's father owned, with Linda, a small chain of 2 bridal boutiques. Linda's Bridal Loft, the name stitched in gold script above both storefronts, where Daniel had worked part-time doing the books since he was 22, alongside his job as a structural engineer. It wasn't his whole income, but it was steady, and it was family, and it had always felt, before that year, like something safe. 3 weeks after the arrest, Richard called Daniel into the Fresno store's back office and told him, without much preamble, that if this kept escalating, if charges actually got filed, it might be best for Daniel to step back from the business until things cooled down. He didn't frame it as a threat. Richard never framed anything as a threat. He framed it as concern, the same way Linda always had, right up until the moment the concern curdled into control. Daniel came home that night and didn't say anything for almost an hour. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop closed in front of him, untouched, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a flatness in it I recognized from the hospital hallway, the same voice he'd used when he told his mother she wasn't his mother right now. He's asking me to choose between a part-time bookkeeping job and my wife, he said. He said it so gently I almost didn't notice he was doing it. What did you tell him? I told him I'd have my final numbers to him by Friday, and then I quit. I asked if that scared him. The money wasn't nothing. $11,000 a year, steady, easy, tied to people he'd known his whole life. What scares me, he said, is how close I came to hesitating. The DA's office assigned the case to Assistant District Attorney Grace Liu, a soft-spoken woman with a reputation, Detective Cole told me, for being unshakable in front of a jury and merciless in plea negotiations. Liu reviewed the hallway footage, Nurse Anand's statement, Dr. Feldman's chart notes, the washout photographs, and the timeline Detective Cole had built, and decided to pursue the charge as battery causing serious bodily injury, a wobbler in California, chargeable as a felony given the medical severity, though Liu made clear early on that a plea to a lesser offense was likely if Linda's side moved fast enough and honestly enough. Whitfield didn't move fast, and he didn't move honestly. He filed a motion arguing the hallway footage was ambiguous about intent, that Linda's hand may have made incidental contact during an emotional confrontation rather than a deliberate strike. Liu's response, when she called to walk me through it, was almost bored. Incidental contact doesn't reopen a 4-centimeter incision, she said. I've watched the footage 11 times. There's nothing incidental about the angle of that hand. Juries watch body language before they listen to argument. This one tells its own story. Then came the 24 hours that took the pressure from background noise to something closer to drowning. Liu called on a Tuesday afternoon to say the grand jury proceeding, if it came to that, needed to be scheduled before a filing deadline the following day. A procedural window that existed because of a scheduling conflict with another case on her docket, one that wasn't going to reopen for another 6 weeks if we missed it. If I wanted a formal statement entered before the felony filing, it had to happen by 5 o'clock the next afternoon. Whitfield, sensing the clock, made his final offer through Carol that same evening. Linda would plead to a lesser misdemeanor, no jail time, if I agreed to a private civil settlement instead of testifying, money in exchange for my silence, framed, as always, as protecting the family. Megan called for the first time in 6 weeks that same night, crying, asking me to just take the settlement, to let this be over before the wedding photographer's album even came back from printing, before it became the thing everyone remembers instead of my wedding. I understood, in a way I hadn't let myself before, that she wasn't calling to check on me. She was calling to check on the story. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Daniel, both of us staring at a ceiling neither of us could see in the dark, running numbers that had nothing to do with money. The settlement offer, the deadline, the felony window closing at 5 p.m., the sound Linda's hand had made against gauze and stitches, a sound I still heard sometimes when a door closed too fast. At 2 a.m., I got up and stood in I got up and stood in the bathroom with the light off, one hand pressed flat against the newer, thinner scar, feeling for the ridge of it under my shirt, the way you check a door frame in the dark to know where you are. $12,000 was the number Whitfield had floated through Carol. $12,000 and a signature, and none of this would ever have to leave a family group chat again. I did the math on what silence cost instead. Every future dinner where Linda would sit across from me knowing I'd taken the money. Every year Renee would keep driving past exits instead of coming for Thanksgiving. Every time Daniel would have to decide, again, whose version of that night got to survive. The number didn't hold up against any of it. At 4 a.m., Daniel found me still standing there and didn't ask what I was doing. He just leaned against the door frame in his boxers, half asleep, and said, "Whatever you decide by 3 o'clock, I already decided at the hospital. I'm not walking that back for a filing deadline." Then he went back to bed. And somehow that was the thing that let me finally close my eyes for an hour before the alarm. At 6 a.m., I called Grace Liu. "I don't want the settlement," I said. "I want the statement on record before your deadline. Then get here by 3, she said. "I want 2 hours to prep you before you sit down with the grand jury." I gave my statement at 3:40 p.m. the next day, in a small windowless room with a court reporter and a table too clean to feel real. I described the hand, the sound, the blood soaking through the sheets. Grace Liu walked me through the medical exhibits one by one. Exhibit C, the hallway footage timestamped 7:04 p.m. Exhibit D, Dr. Feldman's washout photographs. Exhibit E, Nurse Annan's written statement, filed within the hour of the incident, the word slap sitting in the middle of it like it had been carved there. Whitfield tried one more angle before the filing went through, a claim that Linda had been under emotional distress severe enough to constitute diminished capacity. Liu shut it down in one sentence. "Distress doesn't explain precision, and the footage showed a hand that found its target on the first try. No hesitation, no flailing, nothing you'd expect from someone too overwhelmed to know what she was doing." Linda was formally charged with felony battery causing serious bodily injury on a Thursday. By the following Monday, Whitfield had negotiated her down to a plea, guilty to a reduced felony count, no additional trial, in exchange for 3 years of formal probation, 100 hours of community service, mandatory completion of an anger management program certified by the county, and a 5-year criminal protective order barring her from contact with me, including through third parties, including through family group chats she wasn't in, but could still reach through people who were. The hospital's compliance investigation into the records request finished 2 weeks after that. Linda was formally removed from the Community Auxiliary Board, her name quietly stripped from the annual gala program that had, every year for 9 years, listed her as a founding committee member. And then Renee called. Carol had reached out to her, gently, after everything went public in the small, specific way these things go public. Not in the news, just in the version of public that matters most in a family like Daniel's, the version where everyone at Thanksgiving eventually knows. Renee, 11 years removed from a marriage that ended partly because of Linda, called Grace Liu's office and asked whether her own experience might be relevant to sentencing. It wasn't the same case, wasn't the same charge, wasn't anything a jury would ever hear, but Liu included a victim impact reference to the pattern in her sentencing memo anyway, careful and precise, the kind of paragraph that doesn't change a verdict but does change a room's understanding of who's been sitting across from them at holidays for a decade. At sentencing, the judge looked at Linda for a long moment before reading the terms into the record. Linda didn't cry the way she had in the hospital doorway. She sat very still, hands folded, the picture of the woman everyone at the country club had known for 20 years. And I understood, watching her, that the mask hadn't slipped because she'd chosen honesty. It had slipped because the footage didn't know how to lie for her. Richard didn't leave her. I want to say that plainly because there's a version of this story where the husband walks out and everything resolves into something clean, and that isn't what happened. Richard stayed, the way people stay with things they've decided not to look at directly. But he called Daniel 2 months after sentencing and told him the boutique's books needed someone he trusted, and Daniel told him gently that trust wasn't something you could rehire after you'd tried to spend it as leverage. Richard didn't argue. He just said he understood, in a voice that made it clear he didn't, not really, and probably never would. Megan reached out again in the spring, 9 months after the wedding, this time without a deadline pressing on either of us. She asked if we could talk. Not about the case, just talk. We met at a coffee shop neither of us had history with, neutral ground, and she cried for real this time. Not the crying of someone protecting a story, but the crying of someone who'd finally let herself look at what the story had cost. She didn't excuse her mother. She said she'd spent months telling herself that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping her family, and that she'd only recently understood those were two different things that sometimes couldn't both survive in the same room. I don't know if we'll ever be what we were before. I know we're something now, which is more than I expected in that hospital bed. bed, watching her mother's hand come down toward me like the last normal thing I'd ever trust. 14 months after the surgery, I have 2 scars instead of 1. The original laparoscopic lines, small and faded, and the second, thinner scar layered just beside them, a pale seam that catches the light differently when I get out of the shower. Dr. Feldman told me at my final follow-up that it had healed as well as it was going to, that the tissue underneath was stable, that there was no reason to expect complications going forward. I asked him if it would always be visible. Scars don't disappear, he said. They just stop being the only thing you see when you look at yourself. Daniel and I still get invited to family things. Smaller ones now. The ones that don't require choosing a side in a room where Linda might also be standing. We go to the ones with Carol, with Renee now too, who drove up from Bakersfield for Thanksgiving last year and brought tamales. The same recipe, the same quiet kindness Carol remembered from 11 years before Linda ever slapped a wound she'd caused. We don't talk about the case at these dinners. We don't have to. Everyone at the table already knows what the silence is standing in for. Daniel found work 6 weeks after he quit the boutique, a structural engineering firm in Clovis that had been trying to poach him for 2 years anyway, offering $19,000 more than the bookkeeping had ever paid him. He tells people when they ask why he left the family business that it just stopped making sense to keep the books for a store his mother ran. He doesn't elaborate unless they already know. Most people by now already know. I went back to work in September, 11 months after the surgery, and my coworkers were kind about it in the specific, careful way people are kind when they've heard a version of a story and aren't sure how much of it to bring up. I didn't correct anyone's version. I just let the scar do the explaining. On the rare days I wore something that showed it, and let people ask if they wanted to. I kept the photograph Dr. Feldman took the night of the washout, the one logged into evidence as Exhibit D, the one that sat on a table in a windowless room while a court reporter typed everything I said into permanent record. I don't look at it often, but I know exactly where it is, the way you know where a scar sits under your clothes even when nobody else can see it. Linda called once, 4 months after her sentencing, from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. She didn't leave one. She'd wanted, for one evening, to be the only story anyone remembered from that wedding. Now she is, just not the one she was hoping for.